It all began on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day where the sun hung lazily in the sky, and the only sound was the occasional chirping of birds. I was in my backyard, tending to my garden, when I heard the unmistakable sound of someone pounding on my front door. The urgency in the knocking made me drop my gardening gloves and hurry inside. When I opened the door, I was met with the fiery gaze of Margaret, the president of our Homeowners Association. Her face was flushed, and her eyes burned with a mix of anger and disbelief. In her hand, she clutched a piece of paper, which she thrust toward me like a weapon. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through steel. I blinked, confused. "Margaret, what are you talking about?" She waved the paper in my face. "This, your no trespassing sign. It's against HOA regulations, and it needs to come down immediately. If you don't remove it by the end of the week, you'll face a fine." I stared at her, dumbfounded. The sign in question had been on the edge of my property for years, ever since I moved into the neighborhood. It wasn't flashy or imposing, just a simple, clear warning to keep unwanted people off my land. I had never thought it would be a problem. "Margaret, it's just a sign," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "It's not hurting anyone." "That's not the point," she shot back. "It's an eyesore, and it violates HOA rules. The neighbors are complaining, and I've already contacted the HOA board. They're sending someone to deal with it." I felt a surge of frustration. Which neighbors? Who exactly has a problem with a simple sign? Margaret's lips tightened into a thin line. "That's not your concern. The fact is, you're in violation, and if you don't comply, there will be consequences." With that, she turned on her heel and marched back to her car, leaving me standing in the doorway, my mind racing. How could something as innocuous as a no trespassing sign cause such an uproar? That night, I couldn't sleep. The encounter with Margaret played on a loop in my mind. I had always known that the HOA could be overbearing, but this felt different. It wasn't just about the signet, it was about control. Margaret and the HOA were trying to dictate what I could and couldn't do on my own property, and I wasn't going to let that slide. The next morning, I decided to do some research. I grabbed my laptop and started digging into local laws and HOA regulations. Surely, there had to be something that protected homeowners from this kind of overreach. Hours later, I found what I was looking for. According to state law, homeowners had the right to post certain types of signs for security purposes, including no trespassing signs. Not only was it legal, but it was also encouraged as a way to protect private property. The HOA had no authority to demand that I take it down unless it was causing some sort of legitimate harm to the neighborhood, and it wasn't. I felt a surge of relief and determination. Margaret and the HOA were completely out of line, and I wasn't going to let them bully me into submission. The days that followed were tense. Margaret and the HOA made it clear that they expected me to remove the sign by the end of the week, but I stood my ground. I wasn't going to back down, not when I knew I was in the right. I decided to take things a step further. Instead of just ignoring their threats, I started documenting everything, every letter, every phone call, every interaction with Margaret and the HOA. I wanted to make sure I had a record of everything in case this escalated further. And escalated did. A few days later, I received a letter from the HOA threatening me with a fine if I didn't remove the sign within 48 hours. The letter was full of legal jargon, but the message was clear: comply or face the consequences. I was done playing nice. I had already spent days researching the law and consulting with a lawyer. I wasn't going to let Margaret and the HOA bully me any longer. I knew they were overstepping, and I was ready to fight back, not just for myself, but for anyone else in the neighborhood who had ever been forced to conform to the HOA's unreasonable demands. I decided to take things to the next level. If Margaret and the HOA were so eager to escalate the situation, then I would make sure they were the ones who ended up on the wrong side of the law. I called the local sheriff's office and explained the situation. To my surprise, they were incredibly receptive, especially after I explained that I had done my due diligence and that the sign was legal. They agreed to send someone out to inspect the sign and confirm that it wasn't in violation of any laws. Within hours, a sheriff arrived at my property. After a quick inspection, He nodded and confirmed what I already knew. The sign was perfectly legal, and there was no reason for the HOA to be involved. But what happened next shocked me. The sheriff, seeing how the HOA had overstepped their bounds, suggested that they could fine the HOA for trespassing on my property. Apparently, Margaret and the HOA had no legal right to interfere with my sign, and they had been crossing the line by repeatedly demanding that I take it down. The tables had turned. Margaret and the HOA, who had spent weeks trying to intimidate me into complying with their demands, were now the ones facing a potential fine. Word of the sheriff's involvement spread quickly through the neighborhood. People who had been silently suffering under the HOA's oppressive rules began to speak up. They shared their own stories of fines for minor infractions, constant inspections, and demands that they adhere to ridiculous rules. I organized a meeting with some of my neighbors, and to my surprise, more people showed up than I had expected. We shared our experiences, and it quickly became clear that the HOA was not the benevolent organization it claimed to be. Instead, it was a power-hungry entity that thrived on controlling every aspect of our lives. Together, we decided to take a stand. We gathered EVY Denke of the HOA's overreach, documenting every instance where they had VY OLAD their own rules or overstepped their bounds. The goal was to make it clear to the HOA that their actions weren't just a minor inconvenience, they were illegal, and they could be held accountable. The HOA board called a meeting, and I knew it was time to make our voices heard. When I arrived at the community center, I was surprised to see how many of my neighbors had come to support me. They were all ready to speak out, to stand up for their rights, and to put an end to Margaret's reign of terror. The meeting started with Margaret GIVY in her usual speech about how the neighborhood needed to be preserved and how the rules had to be followed. But as she spoke, I could see the tide beginning to turn. More and more neighbors were nodding their heads in agreement with what I had been saying. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up, calm and collected, and presented all the EVY Denke I had gathered. I talked about the law, about my rights as a homeowner, and how the HOA had overstepped its bounds. I mentioned the sheriff's involvement and how they had confirmed that my sign was legal and that the HOA had no right to force me to remove it. As I finished speaking, I could feel the room shift. The neighbors were on my side, and it was clear that Margaret and the HOA's reign was coming to an end. I had exposed their overreach, and now they had nowhere to hide. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to change. What had started as a simple dispute over a no trespassing sign had become a symbol of resistance against the HOA's oppressive tactics. People who had once been afraid to speak out were now emboldened, and the HOA was forced to address its actions. Margaret, once the face of authority in the neighborhood, was no longer in control. Her influence had evaporated almost overnight, and the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the neighborhood for so long began to lift. For me, the VY Tory was sweet, but what really made it worthwhile was seeing the change in the people around me. My neighbors, who had once been too fearful to speak up, were now finding their voices. They were reclaiming their sense of autonomy and taking pride in the fact that they no longer had to live in fear of a set of rules that made no sense. As I stood in my front yard, looking at the no trespassing sign that had started it all, I couldn't help but smile. It wasn't just a sign, Anna Maria, it was a symbol of change, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, it was possible to fight back and win. The neighborhood continued to transform in the months that followed. The HOA, once a feared and powerful entity, was now a shadow of its former self. The board members, realizing they had lost the trust of the community, began to make changes. Their VY said the bylaws, reduced the number of fines, and started listening to the concerns of the homeowners. Margaret, however, didn't take the loss well. She resigned from her position as HOA president, unable to handle the loss of control. Without her iron fist, the neighborhood began to flourish. Neighbors who had once avoided each other now greeted one another with smiles and waves. The sense of community that had been missing for so long was finally restored. As for me, I became something of a local hero. People would stop me in the street to thank me for standing up to the HOA and inspiring them to do the same. I hadn't set out to be a hero, but by standing my ground, I had sparked a movement that changed the neighborhood for the better. One afternoon, as I walked through the neighborhood, I passed by the spot where my no trespassing sign still stood. It wasn't just a sign, Anna Maria, it was a symbol of resilience, a reminder that when people come together and stand up for what's right, anything is possible. And as I stood there, taking in the peaceful scene around me, I couldn't help but reflect on how far we had come. The HOA was no longer the threat it once was. Margaret was no longer the all-powerful figure she had once been. And the neighborhood, well, the neighborhood had found its voice. We had taken control of our own lives, and we had proven that when you stand up for what's right, anything is possible. The VY Tory wasn't just my night, it was the VY Tory of an entire community. And that was something worth celebrating. This expanded version of the story adds new layers of conflict, character development, and community involvement, making it more engaging and dramatic while staying true to the original theme of standing up to an overreaching HOA. Certainly, let's continue the story and bring it to a satisfying conclusion. We'll delve deeper into the aftermath of the HOA's downfall, explore the personal growth of the characters, and tie up loose ends. The story will culminate in a powerful and emotional resolution that reinforces the themes of community, resilience, and standing up for what's right. The changes in the neighborhood didn't stop with the HOA's retreat. Over the next few months, the community continued to transform in ways I could never have imagined. The once quiet streets, where neighbors barely acknowledged each other, now buzzed with life. People who had been strangers for years were now organizing block parties, potlucks, and even a community garden. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the neighborhood for so long was replaced with a sense of camaraderie and shared purpose. Margaret's resignation had left a power vacuum in the HOA, but instead of rushing to fill it with another authoritarian figure, the board decided to take a step back. They held an open meeting, inviting all residents to voice their opinions and suggest changes to the bylaws. It was the first time in years that the HOA had truly listened to the people it was supposed to serve. I attended the meeting, not as a rebel or a troublemaker, but as a respected member of the community. When I stood up to speak, the room fell silent. I talked about the importance of balance, how rules were necessary to maintain order, but they shouldn't come at the expense of individual freedoms. I suggested forming a committee of homeowners to re-VYEW and re-VYSE the HOA's policies, ensuring that they were fair and reasonable. To my surprise, the board agreed. They even asked me to chair the committee, a role I reluctantly accepted. It wasn't something I planned, but I realized that if I wanted to see real change, I had to be part of the solution. While the neighborhood flourished, Margaret struggled to find her place in the new order. She had always defined herself by her role as HOA president, and without it, she felt lost. I noticed her walking alone in the evenings, her head down, avoiding eye contact with the neighbors she had once ruled over. One day, as I was tending to my garden, I saw her pass by my house. She hesitated for a moment, then turned and walked up to my fence. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by a quiet vulnerability. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded and invited her to sit on the porch. For a long time, we sat in silence, the weight of everything that had happened hanging between us. Finally, she spoke. "I didn't realize how much I was hurting people," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought I was doing what was best for the neighborhood, but I was just controlling. I'm sorry." Her apology caught me off guard. I had never expected Margaret to admit fault, let alone seek forgiveness. But as I looked at her, I saw not the tyrant who had tried to bully me, but a woman who had lost her way. "Thank you for saying that," I replied. "It takes a lot of courage to admit when you're wrong." We talked for hours that afternoon about the neighborhood, about the mistakes we had both made, and about the future. By the end of the conversation, I realized that Margaret wasn't the enemy, she was just someone who had lost sight of what really mattered. And now, she was trying to find her way back. As the months passed, the neighborhood continued to thrive. The HOA, once a source of fear and frustration, became a model of transparency and cooperation. The committee I chaired worked tirelessly to revise the bylaws, ensuring that they protected homeowners' rights while maintaining the community's aesthetic and safety standards. Margaret, to everyone's surprise, became an active participant in the new HOA. She didn't seek a leadership role, but she volunteered for various committees and even organized a neighborhood cleanup day. It was clear that she was trying to make amends, and the community welcomed her efforts. The no trespassing sign that had started it all remained on the edge of my property, but it was no longer a source of conflict. Instead, it had become a symbol of the neighborhood's resilience and unity. People would often stop by to admire it, some even taking selfies in front of it. It was a reminder of how far we had come and what we had accomplished together. 1 year after the showdown with the HOA, the neighborhood held a celebration to mark the anniversary of our Tory. It was a festive event with food, music, and laughter filling the air. As I looked around at the smiling faces of my neighbors, I felt a deep sense of pride and gratitude. Margaret was there too, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd. I walked over to her and handed her a plate of food. She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." I nodded. "We couldn't have done it without you." She looked surprised. Me? I was the one causing all the problems. Maybe at first, I admitted, but you've changed, and that's what made the difference. We stood there for a moment, watching the celebration unfold. It was a moment of closure, not just for Margaret and me, but for the entire neighborhood. We had faced adversity, fought for what was right, and come out stronger on the other side. As the years went by, the story of our neighborhood's transformation became a source of inspiration for other communities struggling with overreaching HOAs. People would often ask me how we had done it, and my answer was always the same: we stood together. The no trespassing sign remained on my property, a quiet reminder of the battle we had fought and the Tory we had won. But it was more than just a signet, it was a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of community and the importance of standing up for what's right. Margaret and I became unlikely friends, united by our shared experience and our commitment to making the neighborhood a better place. She never regained her former position of power, but she found a new purpose in helping others and giving back to the community. As for me, I continue to serve on the HOA committee, not out of obligation, but because I believed in the work we were doing. The neighborhood had become more than just a place to live. It was a home, a family, and a testament to what could be achieved when people came together. One evening, as I sat on my porch, watching the sun set over the quiet streets, I thought about how far he had come. The battle with the HOA had been long and difficult, but had been worth it. We had reclaimed our voices, our rights, and our sense of community. And as I looked at the no trespassing sign, standing tall and proud, I knew one thing for certain. Sometimes, all it takes is a little courage, a lot of determination, and the support of your neighbors to change the world. If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.